Eugene Stoner stood in a design shop in Hollywood in the late 1950s, aluminum shavings scattered across a floor that should have smelled like walnut and gun oil, and instead smelled like a machine shop. He was not a gunsmith by trade. He was an aircraft engineer who had wandered into small arms. He built rifles the way other men built airframes, forged receivers instead of milled steel, synthetic furniture instead of wood, weight shaved off everywhere weight could be shaved. He believed he had built something better than anything the U.S. Army had ever issued. Within a few years, that rifle would be manufactured by another company, carried by another company's name, and shipped by the millions to a war in Southeast Asia. Stoner would not own a piece of it. He would not receive a royalty. He would watch America's rifle become the most consequential firearm of the century from the outside. The only thing he would ever get to keep was his name on a patent that had already stopped belonging to him. ArmaLite was Fairchild Engine, and Airplane Corporation's experiment in what aircraft-grade engineering could do to a rifle, and Stoner ran it alongside L. James Sullivan and Bob Fremont. What they built looked wrong to men raised on wood-stocked service rifles. It looked light. It looked plastic. It looked like a toy that had wandered into a war, drafting tables covered in cross-sections. Men who had spent their careers thinking about airframes now arguing over gas systems and bolt carriers, treating a rifle like a small airplane that happened to fire bullets. But it worked, and it worked better than the rifle the Army had already committed to. That didn't matter. The U.S. Army was locked into the M14, and the officers who had pushed that decision through procurement were not eager to be told by a small California workshop that they'd chosen wrong. Presentations to military evaluators were met with polite silence, the silence of men who had already made up their minds and were only being courteous. Early coverage in the sporting press noted the design with curiosity more than conviction. A short mention here, a skeptical paragraph there. Nobody was going to hand Stoner a contract. He had built the better rifle, and it didn't matter because the men who controlled adoption had already staked their careers on a different one. What Stoner didn't have was a factory. ArmaLite's production floor could barely turn out test rifles, let alone equip an army, and inside Fairchild the executives were reading losses, not test scores. The math was simple, and it was against Stoner. Somewhere in that building, a man closed a folder of engineering drawings and opened one of quarterly losses instead. The difference between those two folders decided everything that came next. By 1959, with the division bleeding money and no contract in sight, ArmaLite sold the rights to both the AR-10 and the AR-15 to Colt. Cooper McDonald, a marketing outfit with overseas military contacts ArmaLite didn't have on its own, brokered the deal. $75,000 plus a royalty of 4.5% on future sales. Stoner, the man who had designed the rifle, was an employee of ArmaLite, not a party to that contract. He kept his salary. He did not keep the rifle. Colt had exactly what Stoner's shop lacked: a factory floor built for volume, decades of tooling, a supply chain that could turn a prototype into a product line overnight. Engineers there refined the design into the Model 601, tightened it for mass production in a way ArmaLite's workshop never could have managed. Assembly lines began picking up where prototypes had ended. Rows of machines doing in a shift what ArmaLite's workshop might have managed in a month. The first buyers weren't American. Early sales went to Malaya in 1959, closing before the U.S. military had made up its mind about anything. Then, in 1960, General Curtis LeMay watched a live demonstration at Eglin Air Force Base and came away with something none of the Army procurement officers had been willing to offer: conviction. He requested 8,500 rifles on the spot before a formal adoption order existed, before the Army had moved, before anyone in Washington had officially changed their position. One general's decision to trust what he had seen with his own eyes started moving a design that had spent years being politely dismissed. The room, after that demonstration, went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something everyone doubted just proved itself in front of them. And the men who had done the doubting were still sitting in it. The Army held out longer. The officers who had bet their reputations on the M14 were not going to admit they'd been wrong just because a rival branch had changed its mind. Reports were compared across desks. Arguments circulated through offices that preferred the comfort of precedent to the risk of correction. Then Vietnam arrived, and the arguments stopped being theoretical. Crates of rifles began shipping out of Colt's plant in numbers nobody at ArmaLite had ever seen for a design that once couldn't get a hearing. Factory workers who had watched orders trickle in now watched them arrive by the truckload, production schedules rewritten overnight. The rifle Stoner had built in a Hollywood workshop was now being manufactured around the clock under somebody else's name for a war he had no further stake in. This is where the story usually gets told as a story about two reasonable companies. ArmaLite lacked the capacity to build at scale. That wasn't an excuse. It was arithmetic. Colt took on real risk, spending its own money to re-engineer a design with no guaranteed buyer, betting on a military establishment that had already said no once. Both of those things are true, but true doesn't mean equal. Colt's risk was money. It got that money back many times over, as the AR-15 became the M16, and the M16 became the most popular rifle platform in American history. Stoner's risk was different. He had already paid it. He designed the rifle, and by the time it proved itself in the hands of American soldiers, he had no ownership left in what it became. The company took on financial risk and was paid back at a scale nobody in that room could have imagined. The man who built the rifle got a salary and his name on a drawing. Once the money started moving, the drawing meant nothing. Patent records confirm it plainly. Stoner's name is on the design. Colt's name is on the rifle. Recognition and ownership split apart the moment that contract was signed. They never came back together. From the outside, ArmaLite watched a rifle it had built fill someone else's order books. Fairchild had already exited ownership by then, chasing other business, treating the sale as a closed chapter instead of the beginning of one. In an empty workshop, old prototypes sat gathering dust on shelves that once held the future of American small arms, while a few states away, a factory ran around the clock producing their descendant. Stoner would go on to design other firearms and was respected within the industry as one of the most significant rifle engineers of the 20th century. He spent the rest of his career watching other companies commercialize what he had built, always a step removed from the profits his own ideas generated. That is not a footnote to this story. That is the story. Walk into a gun shop or a collector's room today, and you can still find both halves of it sitting side by side. An early ArmaLite example next to a Colt produced AR-15, built from the same original design, sold under two different names. Ask which company deserves the credit for America's rifle, and you'll get two different answers, and both of them will sound confident. One points to the Colt name stamped on the receiver. The company that built the factories took the risk and turned a rejected prototype into a fixture of American military and civilian life. The other says it started somewhere else, in a workshop in Hollywood, with a man who solved the problem first and was written out of the profits before anyone knew there would be any. There is no balanced answer here. Colt built an empire on a design it didn't originate, using capital it did originate, and it kept every dollar of the difference. Stoner solved the problem that made the empire possible and was paid a salary for it. A contract signed in an afternoon in 1959 decided who would get rich off America's rifle and who would only get remembered for it. $75,000 bought Colt the most valuable rifle patent in American history. It bought Eugene Stoner nothing at all. Tell me in the comments, if you had been Stoner in 1959, would you have signed that contract, or would you have found another way to keep the rifle?